November 7th, 1944. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, leaving the Philippine jungle steaming in the morning heat. Sergeant Thomas Bennett crouched behind a fallen palm tree, his rifle trained on the structure ahead. It looked like any other Japanese supply depot they had seized in the past 3 weeks: wooden walls weathered by tropical storms, corrugated metal roofs sagging in the middle, barbed wire tangled around the perimeter. But something felt wrong. The compound was too quiet. No gunfire, no bodies, no signs of the desperate last stands that had become routine as they pushed inland from the beaches of Leyte. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed because tomorrow I have saved something extra special for you. Bennett signaled his squad forward. They moved in formation, boots squelching through mud, eyes scanning for tripwires or hidden snipers. The gate hung open, swinging slightly on rusted hinges. Inside the compound, rice bags lay scattered across the ground, split open and soaking in puddles. Cooking pots sat overturned near a cold fire pit. Whatever had happened here, it had happened fast. Then Bennett heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the drone of insects and distant artillery. A whimper. Human. Terrified. He raised his fist, halting the squad, and pointed toward the largest building. 2 of his men kicked in the door, weapons ready. What greeted them was darkness and the smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and something else Bennett could not name. Fear, maybe? Or despair so deep it had its own odor? His eyes adjusted to the gloom. Against the far wall, huddled together like frightened animals, were women. Dozens of them. Their hair hung in matted tangles. Their clothing, what little remained, was torn and filthy. Bones pressed against skin so tightly that Bennett could count ribs from across the room. But it was their eyes that stopped him cold. Empty. Hollow. Eyes that had seen too much and expected nothing but more of the same. One of his men whispered a curse. Another turned away, hand over his mouth. Bennett had seen death in 1,000 forms since landing on these islands. He had pulled friends from burning tanks, had stepped over bodies stacked like cordwood after bonsai charges. But this was different. This was not the aftermath of battle. This was something calculated, organized, hidden. He lowered his rifle slowly, trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. The women did not move. They stared at him with the stillness of prey waiting for the predator to strike. Bennett cleared his throat and tried to remember the few Tagalog phrases he had learned. Nothing came. Instead, he held up his hands, palms out, and spoke in English, slow and gentle. "We are Americans. You are safe now." The words felt absurd even as he said them. Safe? How could anyone feel safe after whatever had brought them to this moment? But he had nothing else to offer except his voice and the hope that somehow, against all reason, they might believe him. One woman, younger than the others, maybe 19 or 20, lifted her head slightly. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. She tried again, forcing the words through a throat that seemed to have forgotten speech. Japanese soldiers, gone. 2 days. Bennett felt his stomach turn. 2 days. These women had been left here, abandoned, locked inside this hell while their captors fled the advancing American forces. Left to starve, left to die, left to wonder if rescue would come or if they would simply fade away in the darkness, forgotten by everyone. The discovery that morning near the town of Dagami would mark the beginning of a revelation that shook even the most battle-hardened veterans of the Pacific Campaign. What Sergeant Bennett and his men stumbled upon was not an isolated tragedy, but a single thread in a vast, carefully woven system of exploitation that stretched across an empire. It was a crime hidden in plain sight, disguised behind bureaucratic language and military necessity, a crime so systematic and so extensive that its full scope would take years to understand and decades for its victims to speak about openly. The system had its roots in decisions made far from the battlefield, in the offices of military planners in Tokyo who believed they were solving a problem. In the early years of Japan's expansion into China, reports began reaching headquarters of soldiers committing assaults on civilian populations. These incidents, commanders argued, damaged morale, invited resistance from occupied peoples, and spread disease among the troops. The solution, as they saw it, was to create a controlled alternative. Establish facilities where soldiers could be serviced in an orderly fashion, under medical supervision, away from civilian eyes. They would call these places comfort stations, a term designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The first stations appeared in Shanghai in 1932, crude establishments hastily organized in the wake of military occupation. But as Japan's ambitions grew, so did the infrastructure of this system. By 1937, with the full-scale invasion of China underway, the network began expanding with industrial efficiency. Stations were established in every major occupied city: Nanjing, Hankou, Guangzhou. Each followed a template refined through practice. Wooden barracks divided into small rooms barely large enough for a sleeping mat. A central office where soldiers lined up and presented tickets. Guard posts positioned to prevent escape. And behind every station, a supply chain designed to keep it functioning. The women who filled these stations came from across Japan's expanding empire. In Korea, which had been under Japanese control since 1910, recruitment began with deception. Agents moved through villages promising factory work in Manchuria, seamstress positions in Shanghai, opportunities to earn money that could be sent home to struggling families. Young women, some barely teenagers, signed contracts they could not read, written in Japanese characters they had never been taught. By the time they understood the truth, they were hundreds of miles from home, their documents confiscated, their families told they had gone to work in the war effort. In China, the methods were more direct. As Japanese forces swept through cities and countryside, women were seized during military operations. Some were taken from their homes at gunpoint. Others were rounded up in the chaos following battles, separated from fleeing refugees, loaded onto trucks, and transported to garrison towns. There were no contracts, no pretense of consent. There was only force. By 1942, as the Pacific War expanded, the system spread like a shadow following the army. Wherever Japanese troops established a presence, comfort stations appeared. The Philippines became dotted with them, hidden in remote areas away from major population centers. In Manila, stations operated in requisitioned buildings, their true purpose concealed behind innocuous signs. In the provinces, they were tucked into jungle clearings, near airbases and supply depots, accessible only by military transport. The organizational structure was coldly efficient. Each station had a manager, usually a civilian contractor working under military supervision. These managers maintained records of the women, tracking their health status, their assigned schedules, the number of soldiers they serviced each day. Medical officers conducted regular inspections, not out of concern for the women's well-being, but to prevent the spread of venereal disease among the troops. The women themselves were issued identification numbers, reducing them to inventory in a logistical system. Control was maintained through multiple mechanisms. Physical barriers were the most obvious: barbed wire, locked gates, guards who watched every movement. But psychological control ran deeper. The women were told repeatedly that they had been abandoned by their families, that no one was looking for them, that attempting to escape would result in execution. Some stations posted rules on the walls listing punishments for disobedience. Others relied on witnessed examples, women beaten or killed for infractions. Their suffering meant to terrify the others into compliance. Language became another tool of isolation. Korean women found themselves in stations where only Japanese was spoken by the guards and managers. Chinese women were moved to locations where neither their dialect nor any familiar tongue could be heard. This linguistic isolation meant that even when women from different backgrounds were held in the same facility, they could not easily communicate, could not organize, could not find solidarity in shared suffering. The daily reality inside these stations defied comprehension. Women were assigned quotas, expected to service dozens of soldiers each day. On weekends or before major military operations, the numbers increased. There was no rest, no privacy, no moment that belonged to them alone. Time was measured not in hours, but in the intervals between forced encounters. Meals were minimal, designed to keep them alive but weak. Medical care existed only to keep them functional. When women became too sick or too broken to continue, they were sometimes moved to other stations, sometimes simply abandoned.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Yet amid this machinery of dehumanization, something remarkable persisted. The women found ways to retain fragments of their identity. They whispered their real names to each other in the brief moments between horror. They shared scraps of food when guards were not watching. They sang quietly in their native languages, songs from childhoods that felt like distant dreams. Some scratched marks on walls, counting days, leaving evidence that they had existed, that they had not been entirely erased. By late 1944, the war had turned decisively against Japan. American submarines had effectively cut off maritime supply routes. Allied bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ash. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's forces had returned, landing on Leyte in October and pushing inland against fierce but increasingly disorganized resistance. Japanese commanders, facing encirclement and destruction, began making brutal calculations about what to take in retreat and what to leave behind. The comfort stations represented a logistical liability. Moving the women required transport that did not exist, supplies that were desperately needed elsewhere, and most damning, evidence of activities that commanders knew would invite condemnation if discovered. So, in compound after compound, as American forces drew near, the same scene played out. Guards were withdrawn, supplies stopped arriving. The women were left locked inside, with no explanation, no resources, and no idea whether they had been forgotten or whether something worse was planned. In the darkness of those final days before liberation, some women believed they had been left to die. Others feared that Japanese soldiers would return to eliminate them as witnesses. A few dared to hope that the approaching sounds of battle meant rescue. But hope was a dangerous thing after years of having it systematically crushed. So they waited in silence, listening to artillery fire grow closer, watching through cracks in walls as the sun rose and set, wondering if each day would be their last. This was the hidden landscape that American forces encountered as they pushed across Leyte and into other Philippine islands. Behind every ridge, beyond every river crossing, in valleys and coastal plains, these compounds waited like buried secrets about to be unearthed. The soldiers advancing inland had been briefed on Japanese defensive positions, on supply caches and communication lines. No one had briefed them on this. No intelligence report had prepared them for the moment when they would kick open a door and find themselves face to face with a crime that had flourished in shadows. Sergeant Bennett stood in that first compound, watching his medic kneel slowly in front of the women, his hands visible and empty, his voice soft as he tried to explain that help was coming. The women did not move. They had learned that survival meant stillness, that any action could bring punishment. Even the promise of rescue sounded like another lie, another trick designed to hurt them more deeply. But this time it was not a lie. This time, the footsteps approaching meant something different. The liberation had begun, though none of them, neither the soldiers nor the survivors, could yet comprehend what that liberation would demand from everyone involved. The revelation was just beginning, and its echoes would reach far beyond that rain-soaked compound in the Philippine jungle. What happened next would test every assumption the soldiers held about war, about humanity, about the limits of cruelty, and the possibility of healing. It would force them to become something they had never trained to be, not just liberators, but witnesses to a historical crime that the world had not yet learned to name. The word spread through the American lines with the speed of wildfire. By noon on that November day, Captain James Whitmore of the 96th Infantry Division had received reports from 3 separate units, all describing the same discovery. Compounds filled with women, conditions beyond imagining, survivors too traumatized to speak. Whitmore, a veteran of campaigns across the Pacific, found himself struggling to process information that seemed to belong to a different kind of war entirely. He assembled his staff officers in a tent that served as temporary headquarters.
Maps of Leyte covered the makeshift table, marked with enemy positions and supply routes. Now he added new symbols, circles drawn around locations where these stations had been found. As more reports arrived throughout the afternoon, the circles multiplied. What had seemed like an isolated incident was revealing itself as something far more extensive. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Japanese forces had established a significant presence, these facilities existed. Major Richard Foster, the division's intelligence officer, began cross-referencing the discoveries with captured Japanese documents. Most military paperwork had been destroyed during the retreat, but fragments remained. Supply requisitions mentioning comfort facilities, medical reports tracking disease rates among station occupants, cryptic references to civilian management of comfort services under military oversight. The pieces assembled into a picture that Foster found deeply disturbing. This was not chaos or the random brutality of individual soldiers. This was administration. This was policy. The immediate challenge facing American forces was not military but humanitarian. The women liberated from the compounds required care that exceeded anything the Army had prepared for. Field hospitals designed to treat combat casualties suddenly found themselves managing severe malnutrition, untreated infections that had festered for months or years, and psychological trauma that manifested in ways doctors had never encountered. Standard triage protocols meant nothing when patients flinched away from medical instruments or screamed when male orderlies approached. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, an Army nurse with the 126th General Hospital, was among the first medical personnel to respond. She had treated burn victims, amputees, men with wounds so severe they defied description.
Nothing had prepared her for the women carried in on stretchers from the compounds near Barawan. Their physical condition was shocking enough. Bodies so emaciated that intravenous lines had to be placed with extreme care, veins too collapsed for easy access. Skin marked with scars both old and recent. Eyes sunken deep into skulls, reflecting a kind of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. But the psychological state proved even more challenging. Chen quickly learned that approaching patients directly caused panic. Women would curl into defensive positions, arms wrapped around their heads, expecting blows. Others became catatonic, staring at nothing, unresponsive to voice or touch. A few became violent when male doctors entered the ward, lashing out with a strength that seemed impossible given their weakened state. Chen and her fellow nurses developed new protocols through trial and error. They dimmed the harsh overhead lights that reminded patients of interrogations. They announced every action before performing it. They worked in pairs, moving slowly, keeping voices soft and consistent. The language barrier complicated everything. Some women spoke Korean, others various Chinese dialects, still others Tagalog or Indonesian languages. The Army had interpreters for Japanese, essential for interrogating prisoners and reading captured documents. But finding translators who could communicate in the languages of occupied territories proved difficult. Sergeant Grace Nakamura, a Japanese-American from California serving with military intelligence, became an unexpected bridge. She spoke Japanese fluently and had learned some Korean from neighbors in her hometown. Her presence initially frightened the Korean survivors, her face and language reminding them of their captors. But Nakamura persisted with gentle patience, explaining her American identity, sharing details of her own family's experience with discrimination and internment camps. Slowly, cautiously, some women began to trust her enough to speak. What they revealed, haltingly and often through tears, painted a picture of systematic brutality. A woman named Minji, who looked to be in her mid-20s but claimed to be only 19, described being recruited from her village in Korea in 1942. She had been told she would work in a textile factory in Manchuria, earning wages that could support her widowed mother and younger siblings. Instead, she was transported to China, then to Taiwan, and finally to the Philippines, moved like cargo as military needs dictated. At each location, the pattern was the same. A barracks, a number instead of a name, quotas to fulfill, punishments for resistance.
Another survivor, a Chinese woman who gave her name as Mei, spoke of being taken during the Japanese occupation of her hometown in Guangdong province. She had been 16, hiding in a neighbor's cellar when soldiers conducting house-to-house searches found her. Along with a dozen other young women from the area, she was loaded onto a truck and driven to a garrison town she did not recognize. There had been no pretense of recruitment or consent. There had been only force and the implicit understanding that resistance meant death. The testimonies shared common threads despite coming from women of different backgrounds and nationalities. All described being given physical examinations upon arrival at stations, inspections that were clinical and humiliating, designed to assess their utility rather than their health. All mentioned identification cards or numbers they were forced to memorize. All recalled the crushing isolation, the impossibility of escape, the constant surveillance that eliminated any moment of privacy or autonomy. Many spoke of women who had not survived, who had died from disease or violence or simply from giving up, their bodies disposed of without ceremony or record. As American forces continued advancing across Leyte and began operations on other Philippine islands, more stations were discovered. Each liberation followed a similar pattern. Soldiers securing a compound, initial confusion about what they had found, urgent calls for medical support, the slow process of convincing terrified women that this time rescue was real. Near the town of Ormoc, Marines of the 1st Division found a facility housing 42 women in conditions so squalid that several soldiers vomited upon entering. On Mindoro Island, Army Rangers discovered a smaller station tucked into a valley, so remote that the 8 women inside had not seen anyone for over a week, abandoned with no food or water. The psychological impact on American servicemen was profound and often unexpected. These were men hardened by brutal jungle warfare, by bonsai charges and kamikaze attacks, by the grinding horror of island-hopping campaigns where death came in countless forms. Yet men later admitted that the comfort stations shook them more deeply than combat. Private First Class David Murphy wrote in a letter home that he had seen Japanese soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender, had witnessed the aftermath of civilian massacres, had pulled wounded buddies from blazing wreckage. But the women in that compound near Dagami, he wrote, their eyes empty of hope. That image haunted him in ways that battle scenes did not. It was the calculated nature of it, he tried to explain, the system, the paperwork, the cold efficiency applied to human suffering. Chaplains found themselves counseling soldiers who struggled to reconcile what they had seen with any framework of understanding. How did one process the existence of an organized structure designed to enslave and exploit? Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic chaplain with the 7th Infantry Division, held services in a jungle clearing where men gathered to pray and to talk. Some expressed rage, a desire for vengeance against those who had created and maintained such a system. Others voiced a crushing helplessness, the feeling that liberation came too late, that no amount of medical care or kindness could undo years of systematic abuse. A few wrestled with questions of faith, wondering how such evil could exist, how it could have flourished for so long unnoticed by the wider world. The process of providing care evolved rapidly as medical personnel learned what worked and what did not. Physical recovery required more than treating immediate symptoms.
Women needed careful nutritional rehabilitation, their digestive systems too damaged to handle normal rations. Doctors prescribed liquid supplements, gradually introducing solid foods as bodies remembered how to process them. Weight gain was monitored obsessively, each pound a small victory against the starvation that had defined their captivity. Infections required aggressive treatment with the limited antibiotics available, penicillin and sulfa drugs distributed according to strict priority protocols usually reserved for wounded soldiers. But the psychological healing proved far more complex. Some women responded to kindness with confusion, unable to understand gestures offered without expectation of something in return. When nurses brought clean clothing, several women tried to refuse, insisting they had done nothing to deserve such gifts. Others hoarded food, hiding scraps under mattresses or in pockets, unable to trust that meals would continue to arrive regularly. Sleep was difficult, nights filled with screams and sobs as memories surfaced in dreams. Medical staff learned to expect this, positioning nurses nearby to provide comfort when women woke in terror. Trust built slowly, in increments measured not in days but in moments. A nurse named Dorothy Williams discovered that sitting quietly beside a patient without speaking, simply being present, sometimes accomplished more than attempts at conversation. Another nurse found that allowing women to help with simple tasks, folding bandages or organizing supplies, gave them a sense of control they had been denied for years. Lieutenant Chen began teaching basic English phrases to those who wanted to learn, turning language lessons into a form of therapy, a way to reclaim agency over communication. The question of what would happen next loomed over everything. As women regained physical strength and began to speak more freely, conversations turned to the future. For many, the desire to go home was overwhelming. They spoke of families left behind, of parents who must be frantic with worry, of siblings who would not recognize them after so many years. But the path home was not simple. Korea remained under Japanese control, inaccessible until the war's end. China was still a battleground, its landscape fractured by ongoing conflict. Even the Philippines, being liberated piece by piece, was not yet safe for civilian travel. Moreover, the women faced a stigma that transcended geography. In the cultures from which many had been taken, sexual purity was tied to family honor. Women who had been violated, regardless of circumstances or coercion, often faced rejection rather than sympathy. Some survivors expressed fear that returning home would bring shame to their families, that they would be treated as outcasts rather than victims. A Korean woman named Soo Min told Sergeant Nakamura through tears that she could not return to her village, that her family would never accept what had happened to her, that she had become unmarriable and therefore worthless in the eyes of traditional society. American authorities, overwhelmed by the scope of the problem, scrambled to develop policies. The War Department issued guidelines for the treatment and repatriation of liberated civilians, but these generic directives did not address the specific needs of comfort station survivors. Relief organizations, including the Red Cross and various missionary groups, began arriving in the Philippines to assist. They established temporary housing, separate from military camps, spaces where women could begin recovering away from the constant presence of soldiers, even friendly ones. Some survivors chose not to wait for official repatriation programs. A few Filipino women, once they regained strength, simply walked away from the hospitals, disappearing into the countryside to find their own way home or to start over in anonymity. Others formed small groups, women who had been held in the same stations bonding through shared trauma, deciding to face an uncertain future together rather than alone. The Chinese women faced particularly difficult choices. With China still at war, return was dangerous, but staying in the Philippines meant existing in a foreign land with no resources or support network. The military continued documenting what it found. Photographers were brought in to record the conditions of liberated stations, creating visual evidence of what had existed. These images, stark and disturbing, were classified initially, deemed too sensitive for public release. Officers compiled reports detailing the number of women found, their nationalities, their physical conditions. Intelligence analysts studied the organizational structure of the comfort system, trying to understand its scope and how it had operated. The picture that emerged was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that tens of thousands of women had been drawn into the system across the Japanese Empire, though the true number might never be known, given the destruction of records and the deaths of so many victims. As November turned to December, the Philippines campaign continued. American forces pushed toward Manila, fighting through stubborn Japanese resistance. But for those soldiers who had participated in the liberation of comfort stations, the war had taken on an additional dimension. They fought not just to defeat an enemy army, but to ensure that a system of organized horror could never operate again. Every compound secured, every woman freed, felt like a battle won against something more insidious than military force. In field hospitals across Leyte and neighboring islands, women who had been numbers in a system began reclaiming their identities. They spoke their real names aloud, some for the first time in years. They shared stories of their lives before captivity, of childhoods and dreams that had been interrupted by violence.
They began to imagine, tentatively, what might come after, even as they struggled with the weight of what they had endured. The road ahead was long and uncertain, marked by challenges both practical and emotional. But for the first time in years, that road existed. The walls of captivity had fallen, the silence was breaking. And though the scars would never fully heal, the possibility of life beyond trauma had, against all odds, emerged from the ruins. Up next, you have got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.